This is a science podcast for March 19th, 2026. I'm Sarah Crespi. First up, contributing correspondent Lizzie Wade joins me to talk about new results published in Science that suggest Chile's Monteverde archaeological site is much younger, thousands of years younger than previously thought. This finding is likely to reignite debate over when humans first came to the Americas and how they spread. Next on the show, we hear about groundwater, a vital source of water for both drinking and agriculture that's often overused and depleted. Producer Megan Cantwell talks with researcher Scott Giesecke about his comprehensive review of the many different approaches to improving groundwater supply and what has worked where. Way back in the ancient times of the 1970s, the Monteverde archaeological site was uncovered in southern Chile. It had signs of human occupation, piece of clothing, wooden structures, potentially food remnants. The site was dated to around 14,500 years old, which really challenged the prevalent theory of how humans had settled the Americas. This week in Science, researchers applied a new dating technique to the site and found a much different time for its occupation. Contributing correspondent Lizzie Wade wrote about this controversial new date for the new site. Hi, Lizzie.
Hi, Sarah. Great to be here.
Yeah, happy to have you back. This was a fun one to read. The discovery and the dating of Monteverde really did shake up ideas about human settlement. We're the last continent that people reached, and it's the most recent settlement of a continent, and it's still so highly debated. What were some of the shifts that happened after the Monteverde date came to be accepted, maybe in the 90s or so?
So before Monteverde, the prevailing story was this Clovis first hypothesis, which Clovis is a very specific and easily identifiable technology of spear points and arrowheads. They tend to be large. They're very beautiful. Archaeologists have understood them quite well for like 100 years, and they appear around 13,000 years ago, a little before in North America. Clovis people were assumed to be big game hunters coming down the terrestrial corridor, like between the ice sheets of Canada. Once the glaciers had started to melt, there was like a little opening they could get down into the continental United States and beyond. This was considered the story, right? And Monteverde, which is, as you said, 14,500 years old, was way pre-Clovis.
And
way down,
so far south, right?
Way down in southern Chile, in Patagonia. What were people doing there? The technology was really different. A lot of organic material was preserved. Wood, bone, things that archaeologists don't always get to see, especially so long. With Monteverde, which was, as you said, first began to be excavated in the 1970s, was kind of validated by this like crew of skeptical archaeologists who went down there in 1997, looked at the stratigraphy, what the archaeologists had found, and said, oh, crap, this is good. This is real. And we need to rethink everything. And that led to like a new hypothesis of people coming down the coast, maybe. And now at this point, there are several other pre-Clovis sites that are widely, if not universally accepted, especially in North America. Some of those are around the same age as Monteverde. Some of them are slightly older. But there's always been people who are even skeptical of Monteverde ages and those other pre-Clovis sites. And this new paper is written by some of them, I will say, and threatens to really like overturn the story yet again, using the same site that overturned the story in the other way 30 years ago.
The new paper says that it's much younger. Monteverde is much younger than the 14,500 years. How much younger is it? And what did they do to date this site differently?
They conclude that the true date of human occupation in Monteverde is between 8,200 and 4,200 years ago. So like eventually 10,000 years younger. I mean, this is a very big revision. Huge if true, if, as they say. Yeah. And I will say Monteverde, the actual archaeological site, has been destroyed by the excavation itself, by road construction, by river erosion. You can't actually go back and see in the ground what people saw in the 1970s. I mean, that's true for all archaeological excavations to a certain extent. Excavating destroys the site and then other things happened.
The pieces are there, though. The coprolites,
yeah,
the butchered bones, like those are still in existence. They're just no longer in place.
Yeah. And so you could go back and look in them in the archives. There's been many papers re-examining the materials, re-examining the data. You could conceivably do another archaeological excavation in the same area, although this new paper doesn't do that. What they did was essentially look at the stratigraphy of this river valley. So along the river, as it erodes the landscape around it, you can see the profile of the stratigraphic layers of the dirt and how these experts can determine how those formed and when. And you can take radiocarbon samples, samples for OSL dating, which sort of shows you when a quartz grain was last exposed to sunlight, which is like the craziest true fact in all of science, I feel. So they didn't dig anything. They like sort of walked along this river and saw different places on these profiles where they could see the stratigraphy that presumably, possibly is also the same stratigraphy at the Monteverde site. And so looking at that stratigraphy, what they determined about the history of this landscape and how it formed was that 14,500 years ago, the assumed age of Monteverde, this was actually kind of a forest, a temperate rainforest full of wood. This river that now is there doesn't exist yet. The river is quite small today. 11,000 years ago, a volcano erupted, left some ash behind, at least in some of their deposits, which could be a strongly datable material. It doesn't seem to be present all over the place, so that's a little complicated.
It's not this like unifying layer across the entire landscape.
Yeah, it's not totally uniform as you would hope for something like this. But, it's certainly worthy of further investigation for sure. And basically, like around 8,600 years ago, I think they say this river formed, washed a bunch of this older 14,000-year-old wood down into
Earlier time.
a new layer. Yeah, so it looks like it's earlier, but it's actually younger because the river is like bringing these deposits physically down deeper. So when the original excavators investigated Monteverde, what they were dating was this 14,500-year-old wood and bone that had been like down cut into the landscape by this river. And the new team says when they dated different parts of this chunk of the sedimentary layers, they could tell that the sediment itself was much younger than that wood. And so that is sort of the issue that they're raising.
They took a very different approach. They didn't even look at the carbon containing materials, the seaweed that there was on the site. But when people have dated those items, like the things that are associated with the occupation, what are the dates like?
Yeah, so there are many, many tools. And as you say, seaweed at Monteverde. Monteverde is not particularly close to the coast. So it's like, how did the seaweed get there?
Miles and miles.
Yeah. There are knotted reeds around wooden posts. There are mastodon bones with evidence of human modification on them. Mastodons were like long extinct by 8,000 years ago, although their bones could have still been around if this river downcutting hypothesis is true. And a lot of this organic material, it's not only organic material, it's like most archaeologists would say these are been modified by humans. Those have consistently dated to 14,500 years ago. The new team has never really bought that these are human-made tools. For them, there's really no contradiction. Like these could still just be organic material lying around the landscape and downcut into this river sediments.
They're kind of saying it's all wrong. This is not a human settlement, period.
Yeah. I mean, they're saying like humans lived there after 8,000 years ago. So like they could be using this old wood. They could be using these old tusks at the time. I mean, that's a potential other explanation. Other archaeologists are skeptical that would really make sense for human decision-making, let's say. But this is a problem with radiocarbon dating. Of course, you're dating when the tree grew and not necessarily when it gets transformed into something else. And those dates can be different. Could they be 6,000 years different? That I think is questionable.
We're getting all into it. But you've talked to outside experts, people from this team that did the new research, people who did the original kind of dating, and then outside people who are not in either group. What has the discussion been like? How are people taking this new finding?
This is a very emotional and contentious field of science, and Monteverde has always been at the center of these debates. I mean, it's like poetic that it's the same site that's like coming up again. That once threw the bomb into the field, it's like throwing another bomb in.
Why do emotions come into this so much?
It is a little bit mystifying because like for regular people, like 13,000 years old or 14,500 years ago, like that's not that big of a difference, like archaeologically speaking.
It's all in the deep past for us.
But I think it was because there's been historically a lot of like internal policing of this field. Monteverde was first excavated starting in the 70s. It wasn't validated till 1997 by these outside archaeologists. There was a long time of people saying at Monteverde and other sites, we don't think this Clovis first story is right. And they would just get attacked in the literature, attacked at conferences, shut down. It can get very personal. It still does. Once Monteverde broke apart that story, the policing started to run in the other way, right? So the people who have always been skeptical.
This is the very social aspect of science. I mean, I have to admit that when I saw this paper coming down the pike, I was like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
I have feelings about this. I'm not even a researcher.
Monteverde was a paradigm shift that involves a lot of people realizing that they've been wrong for decades. It involves people not wanting to admit that they were wrong. It involves people saying, no, this old paradigm really is true. And we've always known it. And like, we're proving it again, which is what the new paper claims to do and may do as people respond to.
They rush back in.
Yeah, they rush back into Monteverde. Like, we thought this was settled and it's not.
So the people who wrote the paper are saying pre-Clovis doesn't exist. Clovis is the start of humanity.
Clovis is the first. Yeah.
On the continent.
Yeah.
What do the people who collected the original data, what do they say about this new result?
They are very skeptical, as you might expect. And, there are, to be fair, the ones who had spent decades excavating the actual archaeological site, not just looking at the stratigraphy of the river valley. They have a lot of problems with projecting stratigraphy that you can see now back onto the archaeological site that you can't revisit, that you can't directly compare.
Right. So none of the stratigraphy that they're looking at is directly at Monteverde where all these objects were.
They have some old archival photos that they think show similar things, but that's not the same as being able to visit it again and taking radiocarbon and OSL dates from the archaeological sites. It's not like this is impossible, right? And other experts do say, oh, this is really interesting. This regional study is critical because Monteverde always has been a little weird.
Bit of an outlier, yeah.
Yeah, the artifacts are different. The lifeways are really different. Not only are there not Clovis points, the amount of stone tools are very low. The amount of kind of evidence for making stone tools, which is a lot of what you see at these very, very early sites in the Americas, Clovis or not, they're just not there. Monteverde's always been a little weird, admittedly. So, they think trying to fit it into its broader region is really critical and really interesting, that their geomorphology work is sound. I think, the artifact, the kind of disagreement about whether some of these organic materials that date to a much older age are actually human artifacts, that seems a little intractable at this point. If the human artifacts are 14,500 years old, that seems like good evidence for human occupation then. But if you don't buy that they're artifacts and you never have, well, that's irrelevant, So it's there are lines that have been entrenched over of half a century, and those are hard to break down.
Stepping back from Monteverde for a second and saying, well, there are other pre-Clovis sites that people have turned to since the discovery of the site in Chile. This idea of coastal migration has been investigated more thoroughly. Does this finding say Monteverde is not a thing? Does it really overturn all of that stuff? Because there are all these other data points that are surfacing.
Yeah, I think most archaeologists at this point would say, okay, this story doesn't rest on Monteverde the way that it once did. It was the first to break through the Clovis barrier, as they call it. It's not the only at this point, although, of course, the people who are pre-Clovis skeptics who are investigating Monteverde again, wrote the paper, would say that there are issues with all of those other sites as well, and that they should be reevaluated by independent teams as they have done for Monteverde. Science should be replicable, should be repeating excavations is not a bad idea, right? They might be totally right about this. This is a very emotional, as we've talked about, a very emotional field where people have historically had a really hard time changing their minds. And the standard for evidence for these sites is super high. People are so critical looking at these papers from both directions, and they always have been.
What about the genetics? So we've talked about archaeological findings. So there is this thing, we're going to try to date it. Well, you're not dating it right, or that's not a human thing. What about the genes of the people who moved here?
So the genetics are based on the dates of the human remains that the genetics will also come from. And those genetics continue to be consistent with the 15,000, 16,000 entry into the Americas.
Which camp is that?
That is the original Monteverde.
Okay. So pre-Clovis, Monteverde was super early. Got it.
Basically, you can see in the genetics, you can make estimates for how big a population was and how long ago it sort of started expanding. And they can see around 16,000 years ago, the population that was kind of around and contributing to the genomes of these Native American ancestors that they are studying the population really starts to expand. So like that is indirect evidence that something is happening there. Maybe they're reaching a new continent where there's a lot more room, a lot more resources. Maybe it's happening in Beringia, like not, they haven't even made it to Alaska yet. Like the genetics doesn't tell you where this happened, but it does continue to be more consistent with pre-Clovis peopling.
Interesting. All right, so what's going to happen now? Is everyone going to go down to Chile? There's going to be letters.
Oh, yeah. There's going to be letters. There's going to be a fight. There's going to be entrenchment and retrenchment, and people really are reconsidering the story. It will be really interesting to see. I have a hard time from my reporting for this story and my reporting for past stories of the peopling of the Americas. I know how high the standard of evidence is considered for any paradigm shifting peoplings. I think most archaeologists would say this new paper hasn't reached that yet, but that doesn't mean that with future work, potentially a new excavation of the site, potentially a re-examination of the Monteverde archive of the excavated materials, they could amass more evidence and it could convince people. I'm not saying that's impossible. But I think at this point, everybody's eager to hear the official response from the original Monteverde excavators, which I have been assured is halfway done and will be coming soon. And I think we'll just kind of go from there. Monteverde took 25 years to beat from discovery to validation. These stories play out over a really, really long time. We're just at the beginning.
Absolutely. All right, Lizzie, this has been really fun to talk about. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Lizzie Wade is a contributing correspondent for Science based in Mexico City. You can find a link to the paper, the news story, and a related commentary piece at science.org/podcast.
So good, so good, so good.
Everything you want for summer is at Nordstrom Rack stores now, and up to 60% off. Stock up and save on the brands you love like Vince, Sam Edelman, Frame, and Free People. Join the Nordy Club to unlock exclusive discounts, shop new arrivals first, and more. Plus, buy online and pick up at your favorite Rack store for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you Rack.
Ready to soundtrack your summer? With Red Bull Summer All Day Play, you choose a playlist that fits your summer vibe the best. Are you a festival fanatic, a deep end DJ, a road dog, or a trail mixer? Just add a song to your chosen playlist and put your summer on track. Red Bull Summer All Day Play. Red Bull gives you wings. Visit redbull.com/brightsummer ahead to learn more. See you this summer.
Also on the site this week, in our news site, we have a static electricity mystery solved, probably. This is by freelancer Rachel Berkowitz. She talks about how researchers are trying to figure out why identical materials with identical affinities can exchange charges. Basically, you have two pieces of glass, one gets a negative charge, one gets a positive charge without any rhyme or reason. It's basically impossible to predict how charge will move between different samples of a single material. In the study, they heated it way up and they blasted it with ionizing gas. This is glass in this case. And they stripped off any surface contamination. Doing that, they showed the charging went away. But after a bit, the surfaces were recontaminated with carbon-bearing molecules, and this reintroduced charging. This suggests that organics in the atmosphere play a role in this electric mystery. And one more thing I want to mention is another paper in Science this week on how humans share acoustic preferences with other animals. This is by Logan James and colleagues. And that group found that the sounds preferred by animals, non-human animals, are also preferred by humans and with the same strength. So if a specific frog call is preferred by frogs, humans also prefer that one too. And this was true across different taxa, birds, frogs, amphibians. It's an example of the phenomenon that Darwin called a shared taste for the beautiful. Now, stay tuned for a segment from producer Megan Cantwell. It's a deep dive into all the ways to recharge groundwater.
While groundwater is depleting at a global scale, in some parts of the world, this trend has been reversed. This week in Science, Scott Giesecke examines these success stories, places where aquifers have rebounded, and exactly what interventions made these recoveries possible. Thank you so much for joining me, Scott.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So in terms of our global use of water, how much does groundwater make up of this?
Groundwater is a very important water supply for humanity. It provides about 40% of the water that humans use for irrigated agriculture, and about half of humanity relies on groundwater for drinking at some point in the year.
The sort of overall global trend of groundwater, how has that trended within the past few decades? Have we been using it more?
We have increased our reliance on groundwater, and unfortunately, one of the consequences of that is that groundwater levels are declining in many places around the globe, especially dry places where landscapes are under cultivation.
I saw that you had previously published a paper where you were looking at global trends in groundwater. Did you see some cases of success kind of in this data set and thought, let's maybe expand more and see what's driving it?
That's exactly how this study originated. Yep. So in that recent 2024 paper, we looked at the trends in groundwater levels at global scale in about 170,000 monitoring wells. What we found in that study is that there are a lot more places where groundwater levels are declining rapidly than places where groundwater levels are recovering. And yet, those rare cases where groundwater levels are rising, I think provide helpful lessons about what we might do in the many places where we still have problems.
Going to your review, which looked at 67 cases where groundwater has recovered, aquifers have recharged a bit. Are these in similar geologic areas? Are they not as much in these arid areas? What are sort of the commonalities between them?
The locations where groundwater levels have recovered are split roughly evenly between more humid climates and more arid climates. I think there's lessons to be taken from both the cases in humid climates and the arid climates.
What prompted the recovery of groundwater in these different regions?
At some point, when groundwater levels decline to very deep depths, it becomes increasingly costly to access that water. Wells have to be drilled deeper and deeper, and we have a previous paper in 2021 in Science magazine showing this increasing depth of wells globally. Even if the groundwater can continue to be accessed as it gets deeper and deeper, the ability for those without extensive resources to access that groundwater can become more and more limited. So there could be inequitable impacts of groundwater depletion as well.
In this review, you broke up the recovery into 3 different categories, which is increasing reliance on other water sources, reducing withdrawals through policy actions, and then artificially recharging the aquifer. I wanted to start with kind of the one that it seemed like a lot of places took as an approach, which is turning towards alternative water supplies. So is this turning to existing water sources that they've already been drawing from, new sources, or what did that look like?
It could be either. In some areas, this meant an increased reliance on a water supply that was already available. So Bangkok is a good example of that. Surface water was available from the 1980s until the early 2000s, but its use wasn't that widespread until a fee to pump groundwater was increased in the early 2000s. In other areas, it requires extensive engineering to access new water supplies. And California is a good example of this. Some massive engineering feats have been accomplished in this state to move water from more humid parts of the state to drier parts of the state. It has helped to address the problem of groundwater depletion historically, but it comes at great cost.
When you're redirecting water from other places to recharge the aquifer, is it kind of creating problems elsewhere, or what is sort of the net positive here?
In some ways, we're robbing Peter to pay Paul in some of these cases. Albuquerque is a great example in the United States of America, where they are benefiting from a diversion of water from a tributary of the Colorado River Basin. So the local groundwater depletion problem in Albuquerque has become better in the last decade or so, but at the expense of water availability in the Colorado River Basin, which isn't exactly a water plentiful place.
Overall, in terms of places that are moving towards recharging, what are the benefits of this? What is sort of the danger of the water table becoming too low?
There's a few consequences of groundwater declines. One is that land subsidence can occur where land surfaces actually start to settle, and that can create problems for infrastructure, buildings, or canals. There can also be a dry up of streams that are reliant on the slow seepage of groundwater for their flow. And then also water access for humanity can be jeopardized as groundwater levels decline.
And so in these cases that you evaluated, had these sort of effects already begun to take place, and have they sort of been reversed?
In some cases, these problems have stopped becoming worse, but they have not themselves recovered. A good example is land subsidence. So we have time series of a few places around the globe where groundwater recovery has occurred in a place where land subsidence was occurring during the groundwater depletion phase. And once groundwater levels began to recover, the land didn't rebound. It largely remained stable. So this highlights that there are some impacts of groundwater depletion that are quasi-irreversible.
The other strategies that places have taken to rebound, one is sort of policy, which I thought was interesting, looking across all these different countries and places where there are commonalities.
There were. And the policy interventions take a number of different forms. Some directly target groundwater withdrawals. So for example, there are places like Taipei that have prohibited groundwater pumping, directly targets groundwater withdrawals. In other areas, the policies indirectly relate to groundwater withdrawals. And Saudi Arabia is a good example there, where they passed a policy banning alfalfa farming, which then consequently led to less irrigated agriculture.
Were there any cases where the policy change wasn't effective until quite a bit ways after?
Bangkok is a great example of and highlights the advantages of a gradual implementation of a policy. So the initial policies in Bangkok were passed in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And what they did was they implemented a fee to pump groundwater. And I think what was quite clever about the managers in this location and their strategy was they kept the fee nominal for a couple of decades. And what this did was it led to a great deal of buy-in from the groundwater users in the area. Then they turned the fee up about a factor of 4 in the early 2000s, and that finally incentivized the switch to a different water supply. So there can be advantages to phasing in these policies relatively gradually. Of course, there are other examples where a quick prohibition on pumping can also be quite effective, although it's challenging for the industries and communities that rely on the resource.
I guess in those cases, the alternative water supplies have to already be kind of implemented. In some cases, they kind of had to build out infrastructure, right, to even turn to these different water supplies.
Exactly. That's completely correct. And sometimes that infrastructure just involved a local treatment plant of a river that flows directly through the city. Osaka, Tokyo, good examples. In other cases, like California, it required the construction of massive canal networks. Another example of that is in Beijing Plain and North China Plain, where they've had to construct canal systems that are more than 1,000 kilometers long to move water from the humid south to the arid north.
So the third approach that you discussed in the review was about actually artificially recharging these aquifers. What are the different sort of ways that you can actually do that?
There's two general categories of artificial recharge. One is the intentional recharge of groundwater aquifers, and that can include building a leaky lake where you fill that lake up and let the water seep into the subsurface. You could also directly inject water into wells, and that's what they do in Las Vegas. The other category of artificial recharge that is sometimes underappreciated is incidental recharge. So for example, if there's excess irrigation or leaky irrigation canals, that can also fill up the aquifer, even though it's not done in a managed sense.
Since not all aquifers recharge at the same rate, is it sort of a more necessary step to take in some regions versus others where it's not going to naturally percolate through to recharge?
It depends on your goals. If your goal is to swiftly return to pre-pumping groundwater levels, managed aquifer recharge can be a relatively quick way to get there. But the challenge is it relies on having access to a water supply to do that kind of a project. And that's not always feasible.
Are there other downsides to doing this artificial recharging?
In some of the cases that I examined, there were some cautionary tales. For example, incidental recharge in an area in southern Turkey called the Harran Plain, from largely building out irrigated agriculture projects and seepage from canals and excess irrigation, it has led to a great deal of groundwater level recovery, so much so that the water table, the top of the groundwater, is now close to the land surface. And what that means is that the soils are becoming waterlogged and there's salinization issues in the soil too. So this is harming crop production. I think it's a case of too much of a good thing.
It's a hard balance to strike. When I was looking at the figures too, it's never going to be just perfectly stable after. Is it also sort of good to have these aquifers as a backup just in case there is a drought?
Exactly. This isn't necessarily the right turn of phrase, but it's a bit of a rainy day fund. In fact, it's more of a drought day fund. It provides a savings account that one can tap into, particularly in areas where there's a great deal of climate variability. California is one of those places.
These different case studies that you looked at, was there an increase in the demand for water throughout this time period as well, or a decrease, or how did that sort of work?
There are a few cases where groundwater levels recovered, even though total annual water use actually increased. Las Vegas is one of those examples. In that case, they've really increased the amount of water they divert from Lake Mead, which is a large reservoir behind the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. And that has helped to allow the city to grow and meet the water demands. And they haven't had to continue to increase groundwater pumping in that location.
When you took a big picture look at all of these different cases and many different approaches, were you kind of surprised by the overall trends towards what people were sort of using towards recovery?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway of the study is just it reinforces that groundwater depletion is not some inevitability, that there are things that we can do to actually turn this around. I do need to be a little bit careful as I discuss this study because it's not a causal inference study. It really is an examination of these mostly good news cases What it doesn't do, though, is evaluate how effective a particular policy measure may be or a particular intervention may be. Just because these things worked in one place doesn't mean they're directly one-to-one transferable to a place that's still experiencing groundwater decline.
Since the cases are global, hopefully there's a handful of examples that any location could pull, right, to sort of see what maybe might work for their area.
Broad picture, it's probably best to borrow ideas from cases that are located in similar physiographic and climate conditions as a particular place that might still be experiencing groundwater depletion.
After looking at these different cases of recovery, are there other sort of questions you want to ask with this data set to better understand how these policies actually lead to groundwater recovery?
I am now very curious about the rates of recovery. That's something I didn't do in this paper, and it's a new line of inquiry that I just got off a Zoom call with some colleagues about. Sometimes the rates of recovery are relatively rapid, other times they're a little slower. Sometimes they go nearly back to the land surface, other times they do not. And I'd love to find a way to develop some better predictive power as to what kind of scale and scope of intervention will lead to what kind of recovery.
That sounds really interesting to look at in the future then. Thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you, Megan.
Scott Giesecke is a professor in the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California, Santa Barbara. You can find a link to his review at science.org/podcasts.
And that concludes this edition of the Science Podcast. If you have any comments or suggestions, write to us at sciencepodcast@aaas.org. We also see your comments on Spotify. To find us on podcasting apps, search for Science Magazine. Or you can listen on our website, science.org/podcast. This show was edited by me, Sarah Crespi, Megan Cantwell, and Kevin McLean. We had production help from Podigy. Our music is by Jeffrey Cook and Wen Koi Wen. On behalf of Science and its publisher, AAAS, thanks for joining us.